Speak louder, please." I put my hand up next to my ear from the back of the room, signaling that she would need to raise her voice. She took a deep breath. I could see anxiety turning her cheeks beet red as strands of blonde hair began to fall out of the same nappy ponytail she wore every day. There was something about her so familiar, but I just couldn't put my finger on it. With her face glued to the paper, too afraid to make eye contact, she quickly sputtered out, "Hi, my name is Paisley Jackson, and this is my poem called My Family." Paisley was a shy little girl. In fact, she was one of the quietest students I ever had in my 10 years of teaching, which I guess being the youngest of 11 will do that to anyone. Surprisingly, she was very smart, unlike the rest of her siblings who were dumber than a box of rocks. Lord, the Jackson kids were such a headache, except for Paisley, of course. I just wish I could have given her more opportunities to improve her future. Don't get me wrong, I tried to help Paisley, I really did. I gave her clothes, food, and even had funds lined up for her. But living dirt poor in a shack out in the middle of the desert was a bad hand to be dealt in life. Besides, no matter what I did, it wouldn't have made a difference. Everyone knows that the cycle of poverty is almost impossible to break. I crossed my legs, pen in hand, preparing for yet another bland story about a family I'd never get to meet. If you've ever worked with underprivileged kids, you'd know that guardian involvement is quite rare. When it came to interest in their daughter's education, Paisley's parents were no exception. I have 2 mommies, one named Betty who can make good spaghetti. I call her Mom. She's the one that's married to my dad, Tom. One named Claire with pretty yellow hair. I call her Mommy. Dad calls her his project, his hobby. Being smack dab in the middle of Utah, I've seen hundreds of polygamist families, so this didn't strike me odd. Besides, even though polygamy is illegal, I try to keep my nose in my own business. Mom takes care of us all. She can do that because she's so tall. Mommy wears a pretty silver bracelet. She wears it because she's so famous. Wouldn't be the first time I saw kids coming up with stories about celebrity parents to add excitement to their ordinary lives. I just didn't expect it to come from Paisley. Mommy has me and Tommy. He's one of my older brothers. Mom is a lot older. She has all the others. I cringed. That meant that one of Paisley's mothers had given birth to 9 children. I couldn't imagine going through that many pregnancies. Dad says me and Tommy are a gift from God. He'll never hit us with a rod. His pride and joy is Tommy, but he says the only person he truly loves is Mommy. I looked up from my grade book with a line about a rod catching my attention. However, this wasn't the first time one of my students have accidentally reported abuse. Truth is, CPS picks and chooses who they want to help. Mom is having another baby. She's mad Dad wants to name it Daisy. Mommy can't have no more kids. Her last one died of SIDS. Shifting in my seat, I scribbled down a note reminding myself to deliver my daughter's old baby clothes to the Jackson's shack. As a mother myself, I know babies can be expensive. Dad says she did it on purpose because she wanted to run off and join the circus. Mom says it wasn't her fault. I promised to keep that secret in the me and her vault. I shook my head in sadness. How could someone blame a grieving mother for something she couldn't control? Mommy was the one Dad chose. He watched all of her school shows. They were joined in the night. Daddy says inside her is a lot of fight. Mom is just a cover. Dad doesn't really love her. I threw my hand up, a gesture meaning stop I had taught my students. But Paisley didn't look up. She continued to read, oblivious to my disappointed frown. Obviously, one of her siblings put her up to this as a joke. Mommy says she needs to get out. She wants to show me what life is all about. Dad gets mad. It's his biggest pet peeve. Mommy is sad. She just wants to leave. Mommy sings to me her favorite song. Mom says Dad's head is wired wrong. Shaking my head, I sighed. Another child with so much potential and such a kind heart was stuck in the middle of a lover's quarrel that didn't even involve her. Last birthday, I wanted to take Mommy to see her favorite basketball team. Mom made me a cake with frosted buttercream. I got to go see the Knicks, but Dad said he made a mistake he couldn't fix. Nothing is the same anymore. I don't know why for sure. Now Dad cries at night alone. He asks God, "What have I done?" To Mom, he no longer tends. She hopes the baby will make amends. Paisley rose her head up with a smile, looking for my approval. Although I was appalled at the inappropriateness of her poem, I didn't want to break her spirits. She clearly was very proud of it, and scolding her for something that wasn't her wrongdoing was just going to send that little girl back into her shell that I'd been trying to break for months. So instead, I clapped, making the rest of the class, who were too young to understand the gravity of the situation, applaud too. "Mrs. June, I brought a picture of Mommy for extra credit. It's got one more part of the poem. Can I show the class?" I nodded my head, thinking there couldn't possibly be any details worse than what she already presented. Paisley reached into the front pocket on her old worn-out hand-me-down dress, pulling out an old aging photo. She flipped the flaking picture around, displaying it as if it were her most prized possession. My blood ran cold. I finally figured out why Paisley looked so familiar to me. In what seemed to be a school photograph, smiling ear to ear exactly like Paisley, was a young woman by the name of Claire Daisy. She was a high school student, popular for her ability to gain the lead in every school play that went missing without a trace 12 years prior. She was last seen leaving theater practice late one night, but then she just vanished. No sign of a struggle, no witnesses, no evidence, no body, nothing. Her case was covered on every news station in Utah for a while because of how peculiar it was, until people lost interest. Paisley happily continued. I was so in shock I couldn't stop her. As she read off the back of the picture, "There is one thing I don't understand, and maybe you'll have the answer at hand. If Dad's love for Mommy will never sway, why did he treat her that way? Mom lays her head on a nice soft bed, but Mommy sleeps in the basement under a big slab of cement." After I lost my job in the pandemic, I temporarily moved into my girlfriend's house. She was pretty chill about it, but she had one rule. "You can't go in the basement. That's where I grow stuff." I began to giggle. "Stuff, eh? You got a little weed farm down there?" She narrowed her eyes at me, but didn't reply. I took that as confirmation. I mean, it made sense. How else would she be able to afford this house, with the 2-story foyer and the granite countertops on a teacher's salary? But I respected her privacy and stayed out of the basement. We'd only been dating a few months, and I didn't want to pry. That was before the weird shit started happening. It didn't start out so weird. It just appeared that Samantha was very fanatical about her plants. Every night at exactly 9 p.m., no matter what we were doing, she would get up, insisting that she had to water the plants. "Can't it wait?" I asked, after a week of this behavior. We were halfway through watching a Twilight Zone episode, at a really good part. William Shatner was about to pull back the curtain and see the gremlin on the airplane wing. "No," she replied, her voice flat and emotionless. "What? The plants are going to die if you don't water them at exactly 9 o'clock, I asked, forcing a laugh. "Anna," she said in a warning tone. I took the cue and shut up. I listened to her footsteps down the hall, down the stairs, then the chain sliding against the lock. Then the creak of the heavy door opening and her footsteps descending into the basement. That was the other thing. She always took a long time to water the plants, about 45 minutes. How many plants did she have? Was she watering them with an eyedropper? If this was taking up so much of her time, why didn't she invest in an automatic irrigation system? It was only 2 days after that when I'd opened up our electricity bill. Because I was mooching completely rent and mortgage-free in her house, I thought I'd do something right and pay our utilities. But when I ripped open the envelope, I couldn't stop staring. June's electricity bill was $600. I wanted to pay it, I said, showing her the bill. I can pay half of it, maybe. I wanted to pay all of it. I floundered. I'm so sorry. I try not to run the air conditioning. Maybe it's a mistake. I just don't understand. She took the paper from me and then nodded. Lower than last month. Good, she muttered, as if she hadn't even heard anything I said. What? Her eyes flicked to me. It's lower than last month's bill. That's good. And then I remembered. The plants. They must have a ton of lights to be growing in a pitch-black basement. Is this all from your plants? Most of it, yeah. I whistled. Well, I hope you're charging a ton for it. I can't imagine making a profit on this, or even breaking even. Her eyes met mine, and then a knowing smile crept across her lips. I'm definitely making a profit, she said in an odd, smug tone. Then she folded the bill into her pocket and walked away. I watched her go, her long skirt swaying, her Mary Janes clacking on the linoleum floor, her perfectly brushed hair fanning out behind her. Is this woman really some sort of massive weed dealer? I wondered to myself. 5 days later, the curiosity got to me. Samantha was at the office. I was cleaning upstairs when I heard her Yorkie whining. I came downstairs to find the dog staring at the basement door. Hey, it's okay. A low growl came from her throat. Ruff, she barked. Do you want a treat? I walked over to the cabinets, searching for dog treats. Ah, bingo. I cracked open a bag of imitation bacon treats and held one up. Tutu immediately bounded over. I led her into the family room, gave her a couple treats, and set her up with some toys. Assured she was distracted and happy, I went back into the kitchen to pack up the treats. My eyes fell on the door. What was Tutu so worked up about, I thought, as I filed the treats away on a shelf. Maybe a squirrel broke in through one of the windows or something. Tutu wouldn't be so riled up over nothing. I was already walking over to the door. I raised my hand, fingers poised on the chain. Samantha said not to go down there, said the voice of reason in my head. If she knows you did, she won't trust you. It could take months or years to rebuild that trust. But she won't know, will she? I whispered to myself. Clink. I slid the chain and opened the door. Rickety wooden stairs led down to a cement floor. Rather than darkness, white light spilled out from the left side, as bright as daylight. I took a step, and the stairs creaked underneath me. Then another, and another. A strange smell met my nose, slightly flowery, with a hint of something else I couldn't place. Sour, unpleasant, yet somehow familiar. My feet hit the cement floor, and I gasped. An immense planter tray sat on the floor. Massive grow lights hung from the ceiling. A sea of green extended out before me, thriving. But it wasn't marijuana. It was a vine. Tendrils the size of my arm grew up a makeshift wooden trellis towards the light. Massive purple flowers bloomed along its stem, and oval pods the size of footballs hung at various intervals. Some of its vines spilled out onto the floor, coming within inches of my feet. Wow, Samantha, I whispered. I stared at it for a minute, marveling its beauty. But as I stared at it, a horrible realization settled in me. No, it can't be, I thought, as my eyes darted along the plant. But it was, even though there was no breeze down here, even though musty air was absolutely still. It looked like the plant was moving. The leaves wavered nearly imperceptibly, the flowers swayed, and the main stem, leaning against the trellis that was easily as thick as my waist. It swelled slightly, then fell. Swelled, then fell, in a rhythm over and over, as if it were breathing. I whirled around and raced back up the stairs. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding, and slid the chain into the lock. Tutu looked up at me from the family room, her dark eyes filled with fear. When someone you love just disappears, it messes with your entire life. For me, it was my 13-year-old brother, David. I loved my older brother so much. We were living in a small farm town in the Pennsylvania countryside. At that time, we were living in one of the oldest houses in town. Our house was built sometime in the late 1700s. On the night he went missing, I remember my parents weren't home that night for whatever reason, but back in the 80s, it was considered okay to leave your kids home alone. Me and my brother were both sitting on the floor in the living room, listening to the radio broadcast. My brother asked me to fill him a glass of Hawaiian punch. After I went to the kitchen and poured him a glass, he had completely vanished from the living room. I remember that exact moment as clear as day. Thought he was playing a trick on me. I played along, but when I searched every room in that damn house, not a hair was out of place. He couldn't have gone outside because I was by the front door the whole time, and the windows were sealed shut since by the previous owner. The basement door in the living room was wide open, the only place he could have gone. When I left to fill up his drink, it was shut. I was horrified of the basement as a kid because there's no electricity down there, and it literally looked like a dungeon. I yelled his name from the top of the stairs countless times, but he never answered. Even though I was 11, that basement still scared me. I remember that night, sobbing uncontrollably, and when my parents finally pulled into the driveway the next morning, I was still in tears when I told them about David. Mom and Dad checked the whole house. I then told Dad about how the basement door was wide open and when he walked down into the basement. I remember sitting on the couch next to the basement door, hoping my dad would walk back up with David. But when Dad walked up those stairs, his face had gone completely pale. In his hands were my brother's clothes from the night before. I can't describe how horrified I was. He dropped them onto the ground and walked upstairs to where Mom was. I then got on the ground and crawled toward the clothes. Exactly what my brother was wearing before he disappeared. I sorted through them. Everything he wore that night, shirt, pants, underwear, socks. Everything stripped from him. I could hear my parents' voices from upstairs. My mother then came sprinting down the stairs and got on the phone with the police. My dad ran outside and into the field. When the police finally arrived, the entire police team thought he must have gone outside and got lost in the nearby forest, but I knew for a fact he was in that house. The police officers spent weeks searching the woods and fields near our house. The police checked the basement, but said there was nothing. They closed the case about a half a year later. The entire town assumed it was a kidnapping. I knew it was something to do with that basement, but I could never get myself to go down there. After his disappearance, life continued for our family. We turned David's bedroom into a guest bedroom. I hated how my parents did that. It felt like they were trying to move on. I was unable to. Losing David was a huge damper over my entire family. Something that would hang over our heads our entire lives. Mom's way of coping with the grief was just erasing all memory of him. I hated her guts for that. Every time I looked at that basement door growing up, I could feel something behind it. I remember one day when I was 16, I was putting DVDs away in the living room. I was sitting a few feet away from that door, and I smelled something familiar. The smell was seeping through the cracks of the door. It was what my brother smelled like. I got up and nearly ripped that door off the hinges. I ran downstairs into the darkness. The entire room smelt like David's old bedroom. It was pitch black, but I knew he was in there. I started screaming his name. I screamed his name for hours until Dad finally came down. Dad couldn't smell it. He thought I was insane. I remember I couldn't talk for weeks after that. Nowadays, the 30-year anniversary of David's disappearance is rolling around. I can say it's been a long 30 years without him. I'm now living alone an hour or so away from my childhood town. I had to get out of there as soon as possible. When I turned 18, I started looking toward apartments in town, and by my 20th birthday, I was out the door. My parents continued to live in that house. My mom developed stage 3 breast cancer about 3 years ago and was forced into a group home closer to the hospital. My father was given the option to move with her and sell the home, but he decided to stay there and continue farming. My mother and father had a tough relationship ever since I left the house, so Dad didn't mind the quiet. Later on, my dad fell off his tractor and broke his knee and is now unable to walk without a cane. He then moved in with Mom, then sold me the land for free and insisted that I moved back into that house. I wanted nothing to do with that house. I had to pay taxes for that house on top of my own taxes. I then allowed tenants move in. They were a young couple, late 20s. Of course, my stubborn old man was angry with me for letting a desperate couple live in the vacant house. They've been living in that house for almost a year now, and they called me up last week, complaining about a decaying smell coming from the basement. By that time, I had learned to adapt from David's death. I told them I'd check it out the next morning. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I woke up early the next morning and drove to the house. It felt odd driving back there. Those fields, it all felt so familiar. I tried not to think about how scared I was of that basement growing up. Fortunately, my dad finally added electricity down in the basement. I pulled into the driveway. They were both waiting outside for me. They said it smelt like something was rotting down there. I had everything I'd be needing: asbestos masks, medical gloves, eye protection. I worked as an air duct cleaner a few years ago, so I have some background knowledge. I walked into the house and headed for the basement door. I never seen what it actually looked like down there until now. I opened the door and could immediately smell it. Something was rotting in there. I turned on the light switch. Ahead of me was an empty room. It was small, looked to be about 15 by 10 feet big. This basement had been haunting me for all these years. Seeing it with the lights on felt off. The walls were stone, except for one. One of the walls stood out. It was wood instead of stone. The smell was clearly coming from the wood. The wood was rotting. I walked over and I thought the best idea would be just to tear the whole wall down. I started tearing pieces of rotten wood off the walls. Light started to seep into the other side. There was a secret room in the basement. I stopped, and in front of me I saw what looked like human flesh. I couldn't describe how horrified I was. I would rather go to hell than relive that terrible moment. I started smashing that wall with all the force in my body until it finally gave in. The creature in front of me, just the sight of it made me want to claw my eyes out. It was in a fetal position. The skin wasn't pale. It was white, and it looked like the flesh had been melted to the bones. The fingernails and toenails stretched halfway across the room. The worst part was that it wasn't dead. It was breathing. It was alive. "David," I said in a terrified voice. It slowly lifted its head and looked at me. The face looked completely mutated, but those eyes were my brother's eyes. It tried to speak. It tried with everything in it. That thing was my brother David. I had so many questions. How was he alive? What did he eat? How could he breathe? What the fuck happened? I kept the questions to myself. That was my brother in that basement. This whole time he's been in that fucking basement. I didn't say another word to him. I ran upstairs and out to my car. I opened up my glove box and grabbed my gun. By the time I got downstairs, David had stood up, dragging his long nails behind him. "Julian," he growled. I then shot him in the head. At the top of the stairs were the tenants questioning the gunshot. They walked down the stairs to investigate. By the time I heard them scream, I was already out the door and backing out of their driveway. I didn't shoot David because I was scared of him. I shot him because of how awful the situation was. That was 2 days ago. I've been driving ever since. The only time I stopped was to fill my gas tank. I don't know where the hell I am. Last time I checked, it said I was in Kansas. I don't know what to do. Should I join Davis in the afterlife, or should I try to move on? The most sickening thing is not knowing what happened. What the fuck happened? I keep asking myself. What the hell happened?